The year is 1880. If you were to stand on the O'Connell Bridge in the heart of Dublin, you would see a city caught between the grandeur of the British Empire and the crushing weight of its own shadows. To the west, the sun sets over the steeples of Christ Church Cathedral and the limestone walls of Dublin Castle, the seat of imperial power. But to the north and east, tucked behind the Customs House, lies a labyrinth of streets that the maps of the era barely dared to name. This was the Monto. It was a city within a city. A sovereign state of the desperate, the drunk, and the damned. Spanning the area between Montgomery Street, Tyrone Street, and Mecklenburgh Street, it was a grid of human misery so concentrated that travelers from London, Paris, and Berlin whispered about it in hushed tones. They called it the wickedest red light district in Europe. Not because of its size alone, but because of its efficiency. In the Monto, humanity was stripped down to its barest, most mechanical parts. Through the lens of AI reconstruction, we aren't just looking at old photos. We are stepping into the fog. We are hearing the rattle of the hansom cabs on slick cobblestones. We are smelling the coal smoke, the sea salt from the nearby docks, and the unmistakable, heavy scent of stale porter and unwashed wool. Today, we descend into the Monto, not to judge, but to witness the souls who were erased from history. To understand the Monto, you must understand the kip. In the local slang of the 1880s, a kip was a brothel, but the word fails to capture the reality. These weren't the velvet-lined maisons of Paris. These were tenements, repurposed Georgian mansions that had once housed the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, now rotting from the inside out. Look at that door. It is narrow, the wood splintered and painted over so many times that the original grain is a distant memory. There is no brass knocker here. There is no welcome mat. In the Monto, the door is a barrier and a gatekeeper. When you knock, the response isn't a greeting, it is a calculation. A woman, her face hardened by a decade of this rhythm, peers through a crack. She doesn't ask your name. She doesn't ask your business. She looks at your boots, your coat, and the bulge in your pocket. In the 1880s, the economy of the Monto was purely transactional. The phrase you would hear most often, whispered in a flat, Dublin lilt, was, price first. ###, the interior purgatory. Step inside. The reconstruction shows us a hallway that is perpetually damp. The wallpaper is peeling in long, sickly strips, revealing the lath and plaster underneath. The air is stagnant. It is a cocktail of cheap gin, damp rot, and the metallic tang of blood. The rooms themselves are minimalist in the cruelest sense. There is no art on the walls. No personal trinkets. A rusted iron bedstead, a single wooden chair, and a ceramic basin filled with water that hasn't been changed since the morning. This room isn't a home, it is a factory floor. It is designed for speed. In the Monto, a woman's value was measured in throughput. How many men could pass through that door between dusk and dawn? One of the most terrifying aspects of these kips was the lack of silence. These buildings were never quiet. Because the walls were paper-thin, you lived your life in the ears of everyone else. From the room above, the rhythmic creak of floorboards. From the room next door, a sudden, sharp thud, the sound of a hand striking a face. In the 1880s, violence wasn't an interruption of the business. It was the atmosphere of the business. If a woman screamed, the madam in the hallway wouldn't rush in to help. She would simply check her watch. In this world, empathy was a luxury that no one could afford, and sanity was something that thinned out until it vanished entirely. The geography of the Monto was a masterpiece of accidental cruelty. It was a district designed to trap. The AI reconstruction reveals a skyline that looks like a fever dream. Because the district was hemmed in by the docks on one side and the respectable city on the other, it could only grow upward. Landlords, desperate to squeeze every penny out of the poor, added extra floors to these 18th-century houses. These were architectural Frankensteins. Staircases were built at sharp, lethal angles. Windows were cut into walls where no light could reach. In these buildings, a single room might house a family of 8 on one side of a hanging blanket, while a commercial transaction took place on the other. This was the Architecture of sin. A space where privacy was a myth and every secret was a shared burden. Now, look at the streets themselves: Montgomery Street, Mecklenburg Street, Tyrone Street. By day, they were gray and lifeless, populated by children playing in the mud, which was actually a toxic mix of horse manure and industrial runoff. But as the gas lamps flickered to life, the streets transformed. The women would emerge. They didn't stand in the center of the street. They clung to the shadows of the doorways. The Reconstruction shows us their silhouettes, angular, leaning, waiting. They used the darkness as a cloak. In the Monto, you didn't look for a person, you looked for a movement in the dark. Scattered throughout these streets were the shebeens. These were unlicensed pubs, often tucked into basements. They didn't sell the refined Guinness or Jameson that Ireland is famous for today. They sold rotgut. This was raw, renegade spirit, often spiked with chemicals like vitriol or turpentine to give it a burn. It was cheap, and it was effective. It provided the liquid courage for the men and the numbing fog for the women. The shebeen was the social heart of the Monto, a place where arguments started over a look and ended with a jagged bottle in an alleyway. In this district, the police didn't come to break up fights. They waited for the fighting to stop so they could count the bodies. If the Monto was a machine, the British Army was its fuel. In 1880, Dublin was not just a city, it was a massive military garrison. Thousands of British soldiers were stationed within a few miles of the Liffey, and for these men, often far from home, bored, and poorly paid, the Monto was their primary destination for recreation. Imagine the sound of synchronized marching boots echoing off the walls of the customs house. To the north sat the Aldborough House Barracks, and to the west, the sprawling Royal Barracks, now Collins Barracks. Between these military hubs and the docks lay the Monto. The AI reconstruction shows a constant flow of redcoats, mingling with the Jack Tars, sailors, from the North Wall. This created a unique, high-pressure environment. These men didn't just bring money, they brought a culture of transient violence. They were men trained for war, suddenly unleashed into a district where the law was a suggestion. These were often children, boys no older than 10 or 11, who acted as the scouts for the madams. They would wait near the train stations and the barracks, looking for a soldier who looked lost or a sailor with a full purse. With a tug on a sleeve and a practiced whisper, they would rout these men. They didn't just point the way, they escorted them, shielding them from the rival touts of other houses. It was a professionalized system of human trafficking, hidden in plain sight. Why didn't the Dublin Metropolitan Police, DMP, stop it? The answer lies in the containment theory. The AI mapping shows DMP officers standing at the periphery, Gardiner Street and the corner of the North Wall. They weren't there to make arrests for immorality. They were there to ensure that the civilized parts of Dublin remained untouched. As long as the soldiers stayed within the Monto, the police turned a blind eye. If a soldier was robbed or beaten inside a kip, the police rarely intervened. It was a no man's land, where the Empire allowed its soldiers to sin so that they wouldn't cause trouble in the respectable city. In a world without antibiotics, the Monto was a biological ticking time bomb. By 1880, the Great Pox, syphilis, and the clap gonorrhea were the true rulers of the district. The working dead look closely at the faces in the Reconstruction. You see women who should be in the prime of their lives, yet their skin is sallow, their eyes sunken. This wasn't just poverty, it was the slow, agonizing progression of untreated disease. In the 1880s, a woman in the Monto was expected to work until she physically collapsed. There was no sick leave. If she couldn't stand, she couldn't earn. We see the haunting image of women leaning against the damp brickwork of Mecklenburg Street, shivering with fever in the Dublin rain, still trying to catch the eye of a passing soldier. They were the working dead, caught in a cycle where the only exit was the hospital or the grave. The horror of the Lock Hospital. When a woman became too visibly ill to ignore, she was sent to the Westmoreland Lock Hospital. The word lock was literal. These were prisons disguised as medical facilities. Under the Contagious Diseases Acts, Any woman suspected of prostitution could be forcibly examined by a police doctor. If she was found to be infected, she was locked away. The treatments of 1880 were as horrific as the diseases themselves. Mercury rubs. Women were rubbed with mercury ointments until they drooled and their teeth fell out. A cure that was often as lethal as the syphilis. Invasive exams. Using unsterilized instruments, doctors performed exams that were more like assaults, often spreading the very infections they were trying to track. The eye shows the replacement rhythm. The moment a woman was taken to the Lock Hospital, her spot on the corner was filled by a new girl, often a teenager from the rural west of Ireland, unaware that she was stepping into a death sentence. There is a question that the AI reconstruction forces us to ask: where did they all go? Thousands of women pass through the Monto every decade, yet there is no Monto cemetery. The Monto functioned on disposability. When a woman became too damaged for the high-end kips, she was moved to the lower kips. When she was too ill for those, she moved to the streets. And when she could no longer walk the streets, she simply vanished. There were no funerals. There were no obituaries. In the 1880s, a woman from the Monto was often estranged from her family. To her parents in Cork or Galway, she was already dead, a source of family shame never to be spoken of. When she died in a Dublin tenement, she died as a Jane Doe. The pauper's grave. The reconstruction takes us to the outskirts of the city, to the unmarked sections of Glasnevin Cemetery. Here, the disposal was completed. Bodies were placed in common graves, large pits where the poor were stacked like cordwood. No names were carved into stone. No prayers were said over the individual. The district consumed their youth, their health, and finally, their identity. The Monto didn't just take their lives, it took their memory. This was the ultimate success of the system. It left no evidence of its victims. While the men of Dublin held the titles in the light, the women of the Monto held the power in the dark. The madams were the architects of the district. They were often former workers themselves who had survived long enough to buy their way into management. In a Victorian world where women had no vote and few property rights, these madams ran multi-million-pound empires. The legend of the pig and May Oblong. The AI reconstruction brings to life the most notorious figures of the 1880s. First, there was Elizabeth the Pig Lynch. She didn't get her name from her looks, but from her ferocity. She owned a string of high-end kips and was known to physically throw unruly soldiers out of her front door. She was a businesswoman who understood branding. Her houses were the only ones with clean linens and fresh girls, and she charged a premium for it. Then there was May Oblong. Her real name was Marion Kelly, but May Oblong was the name that whispered through the barracks. She was the diplomat of the Monto. She knew which police inspectors to bribe, which priests to donate to, and which politicians to keep entertained. She was the glue that held the district's alliance with the respectable world together. The iron fist of the tenement. These madams were not motherly figures. The reconstruction shows the psychological control they exerted. They operated on a system of debt bondage. The costume debt. When a young girl arrived from the country, the madam would provide her with a dress, boots, and a room. The cost was astronomical. The deductions: money was deducted for protection, for laundry, and for the sheer privilege of working. A girl in the Monto could work for 5 years and still owe the madam more than she did on her first day. This was the invisible chain that kept the district's workforce from ever walking away. By the late 1880s, the tide began to turn. The containment that the police favored was no longer enough for a rising class of Irish nationalists and religious reformers. They saw the Monto not just as a den of sin, but as a colonial stain, a place where Irish women were sacrificed for British soldiers. The moral underground. The reconstruction shows the first vigilance committees. These were groups of laymen and priests who began to patrol the edges of the Monto. They didn't carry guns, they carried rosaries and notebooks. They began to write down the names of the men entering the kips. This was the birth of social shaming. If a middle-class clerk from a Dublin bank was seen entering May Oblong's house, his name might find its way to his employer the next morning. The anonymity that the Monto relied on was being systematically dismantled. Frank Duff and the Legion of Mary, though he would become more prominent later, the seeds of Frank Duff's crusade were sown in the echoes of the 1880s. He represented a new kind of reformer, one who didn't just want to arrest the women, but to save them. The AI portrays the tension in the air. On one side of the street, the madams and their enforcers, men known as bullies, who protected the houses. On the other side, the religious crusaders. It was a cold war for the soul of Dublin. The Monto was no longer a secret. It was a battlefield. To understand why the Monto didn't collapse sooner, we have to look at the Broadstone railway station. Every week, the West train arrived. The rural pipeline, the Reconstruction, captures the arrival of the greenhorn. A girl, perhaps 16, stepping off a train from Mayo or Galway. She has one suitcase and no contacts. She has come to Dublin because the famine-haunted lands of the West offer no future. Waiting for her at the station isn't a job agent, but a spotter for a madam. They offer her a meal, a respectable place to stay, and a job as a domestic servant. By the time the sun sets, she is inside a tenement in the Monto. She is told she cannot leave until she pays for the meal she just ate. This was the human pipeline that kept the Monto alive. For every woman who vanished into the lock hospital, a new one arrived on the 4 p.m. train. As we move toward the conclusion of this massive narrative, we look at the physical erasure of the district. The cartography of guilt in the late 1880s and early 1890s, the Dublin Corporation began a process of amnesia. They realized they couldn't stop the sin, so they tried to rename the geography. Montgomery Street became Foley Street. Mecklenburg Street became Railway Street. Tyrone Street became Corporation Street. The AI shows the painters changing the street signs. They thought that by changing the names, they could scrub the blood and the history from the bricks. But the people of Dublin knew. For decades, even after the signs were changed, no respectable person would walk down Foley Street after dark. The ghosts were too thick.